While samadhi and jhana are likely the most popular and most misunderstood Dhamma topics out there, virtue, or, well, sila, are similarly misunderstood. People usually have, well, some idea of virtue, but in most cases practicing sila is a somewhat mindless practice of sticking to certain rules and precepts, like the 5 precepts. While it is surely better than not sticking to the precepts, this kind of sila is absolutely not enough and not leading to the samadhi that is praised by the noble ones. Today we try to understand what virtue truly is according to the suttas. Well, as most of the time, let us start with a few examples. And in this case, I want to start with a few modern traditions. And when it comes to that, it is usually stated that virtue is simply the keeping of the 5 precepts. You blindly adhere to those rules, and there's not really any understanding involved. And when you look at the suttas, the Buddha most of the time taught the 5 precepts to people who did not really have higher ambitions when it comes to the Dhamma practice. They just stick to those rules and were aiming for a higher rebirth. I think at some point the Buddha even said that the keeping of the 5 precepts is what keeps humans from falling back toward the animal realm. So as long as you keep them, you have a safeguard against that. But it's not really a safeguard. The only real safeguard that you can get is the right view, which really prevents you from going back to the netherworld. But in the end, since you just stick to rules and there's no real intentionality and craving work involved, you are not really making much progress when it comes to Dhamma practice. It's not really related to craving and not really related to intentionality. Sure, you make sure that you at least avoid the 5 kinds of intentions that are mentioned in the 5 precepts. But apart from that, what do you gain? There are still so many areas in your life that could and are infested by craving and totally not covered by the 5 precepts. So if you want a better coverage, you would have to change your behavior, change your rules and observances to something that is more akin to the 8 precepts, as an example. And the relationship with the path, in the case of the 5 precepts, for most practitioners nowadays, I would say, is completely unclear. And they cannot really state how the practice of virtue leads, for example, to the fortification of samadhi. They call it a preparationary exercise. But in the end, it's not. It is the training that you undergo if you practice virtue rightly and really start working with your intentions. If you start working with your intentions, craving as a whole will become more apparent to you. And such a practitioner might still binge watch series. They might still eat lots of fast food. They might still indulge in philosophical discussions online. They might still do all kinds of things. And in the case of a monk, as an example, they can still eat lots of, I don't know, dark chocolate or hard cheese in the afternoon, even though they should not eat after midday. They can still gather lots of robes or whatever and always pick the best stuff from the alms food that is offered. And do all kinds of things. That is not prevented by any of the precepts. Yet it is clearly possible that you have lots of craving involved in this kind of process. You could still debate the Dhamma to win debates or to gain fame and praise by others. And there are many more cases of areas of your life that are not covered, but that are very much related to your behavior of body and speech. And this is what virtue truly is. Everything that is related to craving that you do with the body and with your mouth, so to speak. And in the case of the suttas, you can also get a glimpse of what the people back then thought of as virtue. There is a case of a monk, I think he was, or a Brahmin, more or less. He was 120 years old, and he instructed one of his disciples to go follow the Buddha around for 7 months and observe all his actions and all his speech. And after those 7 months, he came back to the Brahmin and reported what he has seen when it comes to the behavior of the Blessed One. And then, I will cite a bit from the suttas, he pretty much stated, when the Buddha goes indoors, he does not raise or lower his body or bend it forward or back. He turns around neither too far from the seat nor too near it. He does not lean on the seat with his hands. He does not throw his body onto the seat. He does not fidget with his hands. He does not fidget with his feet. He receives neither too little or too much water for the bowl. He washes the bowl without making splashing noises. He receives neither too little rice nor too much rice. He adds sauce in the right proportion. He does not exceed the right amount of sauce in the mouthful. He turns the mouthful over 2 or 3 times in his mouth and then swallows it. When he has eaten, he sits in silence for a while. He walks neither too fast nor too slow, and he does not go as one who wants to get away from something. His robe is worn neither too high nor too low on his body. nor too tight against his body, nor too loose on his body. The speech that issues from his mouth has 8 qualities. It is distinct, intelligible, melodious, audible, ringing, euphorious, deep, and sonorous. But while his voice is intelligible, as far as the audience extends, his speech does not issue out beyond the audience. We have seen Master Gautama walking, sir. We have seen him standing. We have seen him entering indoors, and we have seen him indoors seated in silence after eating. We have seen him giving the blessing after eating. We have seen him going to the monastery in silence. And as you can see, this monk has, or this novice in this case, has pretty much observed all the kinds of actions that the Buddha has been doing with his body. He has listened to all the kinds of words that the Buddha was speaking. And this is how people back then addressed someone's virtue. They have observed everything that they can from that person, every kind of behavior, every kind of speech. And you really cannot get this kind of virtue by just keeping the 5 precepts. This is not how virtue works. And if the Buddha would still engage in certain kinds of behaviors, would you find him to be pure and virtuous? If he, for example, might be keeping the 5 precepts, or even the 8 precepts, but would still feverishly debate with other people, and the same for any other monk, would you consider him to be a saint, to be pure, to be virtuous? Very likely not, because all those behaviors are indicators of the inner value system of a person. And your behavior and your speech kind of reflect your inner values all the time. Your actions are sooner or later always in line with your value system. And if the Buddha, for example, would overeat all the time, if he overslept all the time, would you still regard him to be virtuous? Well, I would probably not. Any monk that would overeat or overindulge in that case, I would consider to be not virtuous, because I can see their behavior. And sometimes the Buddha did all those things, by the way. He did overeat, or presumably overeat, because he had to go for a long walk. Sometimes he was sleeping in a king's palace. Sometimes he was wearing silken robes. There's a sutta that lists all kinds of things that the Buddha did, where other followers of his did better than he. Yet they were still following the Buddha and not the other way around, even though it seemed, at least, his virtue was not on par with the behavior of one or some of his followers. But again, this just highlights the nuances. This highlights that all of this kind of talk around virtue is in reality circling around your intentionality. Something is bad when the intention behind it is bad. And you can, for example, try to understand this better if you look at this kind of diagram that I have prepared. Again, I really like those floating squares. There is, for example, at the bottom left, what virtue really is. The real understanding that the Buddha tried to convey when it comes to the suttas, when it comes to virtue. This is very related to the mundane right view, by the way, where you really understand what craving really is and how it leads to the diminishing of suffering, at least. And then there is typically your idea of virtue. That is a whole different thing. It might have an overlap. You partially understand what virtue really is and get some aspects right, but there are aspects that are completely missing, for example, and there are things that you might consider virtue that are totally not virtue. For example, if you think that going to, certain kinds of stores because they just, offer luxury foods is always bad. That's not really the case. If there's nothing that is offered around the area where you live, then you just go to that store without greed, aversion, or delusion. And if you don't do any kind of action with the body or with your mouth that is related to greed, aversion, and delusion, then it's quite virtuous. But you cannot see it, because virtue is not about sticking to blind rules and observances. It's not about keeping precepts or anything like that. It is always about your craving. It's always about your intentionality. And this is very important. And your job is, at least at the beginning, to attain a more mundane right view, which might not yet be world transcendent, but you at least want to understand what virtue is really about. Because only then will your mind be prepared to actually understand the Dhamma. And this is very important, by the way. You don't want to misunderstand that. Because when you leave out something that is clearly about virtue, then you have blind spots regarding craving. And in essence, virtue is literally everything that others can see or hear from you that is likely motivated by greed, aversion, and delusion. Sure, you cannot tell in all cases. Because, again, the Buddha was wearing silken robes, and he was sometimes eating 2 or 3 bowls of food filled to the brim because he had a long walk ahead of him. But most of the time, if there's not a good reason like that, then your greed will surface sooner or later. And this, by the way, applies at all times, in all postures, regarding all bodily and verbal actions. This is what true virtue is about. everything that others can see of you. And so if you want to be even more precise, you can and should define virtue as abstaining from all behaviors in body and speech that are rooted in greed, aversion, and delusion. And as you can see, this must involve working with your intentionality, because intentions are of greed, of aversion, or of delusion or distraction, depending on how you want to phrase it. And this is a much, much bigger task than just keeping 5 precepts. Keeping 5 precepts is relatively easy. There's not much work involved. Sure, if you are very addicted to, I don't know, lying or something like that, then it might be challenging in the beginning. But after a while, it will be relatively easy. So this is much more ambiguous. It's much harder to do. It requires much more work, and it requires you to be on your toes, so to speak, at all times, because all of your intentions could be wrong. And this is not captured by precepts, and not even captured by the rules for monk and nuns. I mean, in the end, there are rules like you should not take garlic or anything like that. This will not liberate you in itself, but it shows you that certain kinds of behaviors should be questioned. And those are the behaviors that should have been questioned in the past. It led to quarrels and problems in the past. So why do you think people do not do this kind of virtue? Because you have to transform your entire life with this kind of practice. And then, only then, when you have transformed your entire life, the Buddha really starts talking about samadhi. I mean, you can try to develop samadhi before that. Samadhi would just be also reining in your inner values and your inner behaviors of mind. But this usually requires a thorough abstaining from all the kinds of bodily intentions, because they are much more gross and they are hiding the mental actions and intentions from you. And people typically do not like to follow this kind of virtue. It is exhausting, as you have to check everything you do with the body and with the mouth. It is doubt-inducing because you cannot really be sure, or you have to, through your practice, gain clarity of what virtue truly is. Yet you could ask yourself, would you really consider someone virtuous if they indulged, even if it is allowed by the precepts? I mean, I would not. But many people that blindly follow the precepts would consider themselves to be virtuous. And when someone points out that they are likely not, because there are all kinds of behaviors that are going against virtue, then they probably get quite defensive and maybe even mad. And there are much better approximations for virtue, as in you could start keeping the 8 precepts, as that kind of includes the at least moderation of sensuality. But even then, there are lots of loopholes that you can use to still sensually indulge in this way or that way, because any set of fixed rules can never cover everything, because there is an infinite amount of behaviors and environments in samsara, and you cannot capture all those by certain rules or precepts. Even keeping the 10 precepts that do not allow you to take any money, which is very impractical for householders, even then you can find loopholes. Yet even all the rules, all the 200, 300 rules for monks and nuns, you can still find ways to indulge. You can indulge in having better medicine, better robes. I don't know. You can even indulge in virtue, as in develop a view around sitting down more graciously than anyone else or anything like that. It's still fundamentally craving. And the Buddha's teachings are all about the gradual elimination of craving from your experience. And as mentioned in the simile of purifying gold, you start with the grosser defilement of the mind, and then you work your way up to the more finer ones. For that, you surely have to repeatedly and often check if there actually is craving, either directly or if you can discover it by its symptoms. Because craving does produce symptoms, even if you cannot see it directly. If you, for example, have actions of your body or of your speech that are absolutely directed at getting something nice or something like that, then you can infer from that you must be acting out of craving, even if you cannot see it clearly right now. So this is something that you can do. And this is the job of virtue. And it seamlessly feeds into your samadhi. Virtue would be the external withdrawal from craving, and samadhi would be the internal withdrawal. Because even if you refrain from all the actions of body and speech that are related to craving, you might still internally value those things. You might still be internally drawn toward those things. Or as the Buddha put it in the simile of the wet log, even if you remove a piece of wood from the water, it would still be wet internally. it needs time to dry off. And when the Buddha taught others how to be virtuous, you could, for example, look at some of the suttas that he addressed to his son Rahula. And he said to him, Rahula, when you wish to do an action with the body, you should reflect upon that same bodily action thus. Would this action that I wish to do with the body lead to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both? Is it an unwholesome bodily action with painful consequences, with painful results? When you reflect, if you know this action that I wish to do with the body would lead to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both, if it is an unwholesome bodily action with painful consequences, with painful results, then you should definitely not do such an action with the body. But when you reflect, if you know this action that I wish to do with the body would not lead to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both, it is a wholesome bodily action with pleasant consequences, with pleasant results, then you may do such an action with the body. And the Buddha repeated the same thing for the actions of the mouth, or the speech, and also for the actions of the mind. But this is a bit more advanced. And he also encouraged us to do that before doing an action, while doing an action, and after doing an action. So you can read that up in Majjhima Nikaya number 61 in case you are interested in that. So you, in essence, you want to use your memory of the instructions that the Buddha gave you to check against everything you do before, while, and after you do it. The mental aspect is technically more advanced, but you can try to do that too. You can develop the virtue and the samadhi in parallel to some degree. But in essence, the samadhi only really comes to fruition when there's nothing left, so to speak, when you are truly beyond the hindrances. And in short, virtue is the natural, coarse, early practice that erodes craving on the level of the body and on the level of the speech. And those two, your actions of body and your actions of speech, are the primary fuels for renewed addiction to sensuality. Whereas, for example, you can see this quite easily in the case of a drug addict, who surely fuels his addiction by continuing his drug actions. So as long as a drug addict continues taking his drug of choice, he keeps himself in a maimed and injured condition. And the same is true for actions of sensuality. You keep yourself addicted to sensuality by repeatedly engaging in sensuality. I mean, the Buddha gave us numerous similes when it comes to that. For example, he said a priest is only considered to be a priest because of the priest things he does and because of his priest possessions. And a king is only defined by his actions and by his possessions too. The Buddha went to great lengths to illustrate how a king has 7 kinds of treasures and 4 kinds of behaviors that makes him dear and agreeable to everyone else. Or in short, he is defined by the things he has and by the things he does. So as long as he keeps doing the king things, he will be regarded a king. If he stops doing the king things and no longer have the king possessions that are more or less a result of his king behaviors, then he will lose his kingship and he will no longer be regarded a king. He will be driven away from his former kingdom by his prior followers. And in the end, the Buddha gave us his simile of purifying gold. He essentially said, monks are gross defilements of gold, soil, grit, and gravel. Now the soil remover, or his apprentice, washes, rinses, and cleans it. And then there are middle and fine defilements of gold, like grit and coarse sand. And they wash that too from the ore. And then there are fine sands and black dusts. And only then, when all those things are washed away, he starts smelting the gold. And then the dross has been removed. And so too, monks, gross defilements, or like bodily, verbal, and mental misconduct, sensual thoughts of ill will, and then thoughts of harming, thoughts about relations, thoughts about the country, thoughts about his reputation. And when all of that is gone and cleaned, one after another, layer after layer, there comes a time when his mind becomes internally steady, composed, unified, and concentrated. So only when all those defilements of the mind have been taken care of, then the mind will gather in samadhi, in the true full samadhi, I would say. And this is from Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Threes, number 101, I think. Yeah. And the Buddha even gave some very frequent talks shortly before he was passing away. And it is reported in the suttas that he gave such a talk like, I don't know, nearly 100 times or so. And this is from Digha Nikaya number 16, where it is simply stated, such is virtue, such is samadhi, such is wisdom. When samadhi is fortified by virtue, it is very fruitful and beneficial. When wisdom is fortified by samadhi, it is very fruitful and beneficial. And when the mind is fortified by wisdom, it is rightly freed from the defilements, namely the defilement of sensuality, desire to be reborn, and the defilement of ignorance. So all of this stands and hinges on your development of virtue. Because if your actions are not purified, then you can be absolutely certain that your speech is not purified and that it has blind spots, and that your views and mental conduct are not purified and that you have blind spots. Because if your views and your mental actions would be purified, then they would not result in sensual behavior, as an example. Yeah. But anyway, I think that should be enough on virtue. Let us now come to the most important points of this video. First, our understanding of virtue is usually limited and full of blind spots. We have an idea of what virtue is, and it has some overlap with what the Buddha taught as virtue, but it is not fully perfected. But we need to perfect it. We have to make it spotless. We usually hold wrong views regarding virtue, and those wrong views hold us back to understand virtue for what it is. Namely, it pertains to all kinds of bodily and verbal actions. And virtue thus must transform every bodily and verbal action away from craving. It requires us to stop, and it requires and encourages multiple times of checking, pretty much all the time. We really have to make sure that our intentions are right ones, and not only then go through with an action, if the intentions are good ones. And there is no right samadhi without, well, a right view on virtue, let's say. If you have lots of blind spots when it comes to your virtue, then whatever samadhi you attain will be limited. It will not be the Samma samadhi that the Buddha was talking about. And Samma samadhi will naturally arise for one who is accomplished in virtue. There will come a time, as the Buddha said over and over again, when the mind will gather in samadhi, when you have stopped all those actions that fuel the view of sensuality. And when that view has been abandoned, then the mind will enter samadhi. Anyway, this should be enough for today. Thank you very much for listening in. If you enjoy what we do here on this channel, feel free to like, subscribe, and maybe join the Dhamma Discord server. But apart from that, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.